Good afternoon. I'm Alan Van Amen, Product Development Marketing Manager for the Copper Cutter Aero Kits. We're proud to be a sponsor of the Alpha Ag Network Summit taking place. Anyway, our Copper Cutter Aero Kits originated out at the Copper Family Farms by Cimarron. We had a desire to create a header system to harvest sorghum in a very reliable method. We had tried using the old row crop heads and tried some short line headers. But out of that, we decided to take our corn heads, take off the worn out stock rolls, trash knives, and deck plates. And then we designed and developed our own dual disc cutting system that goes in place of the stock rolls and are driven by the gathering chains. Those discs, 9-inch diameter, simply run and turn variable speed through the field, do an excellent job at harvesting sorghum. Cuts the milo heads off, but leaves nice stubble in the ground for improved ground and conservancy, crop and soil conservation purposes. Anyway, our aero kits are available for John Deere, Case IH, New Holland, AGCO, and Gleaner combines and headers. Nice thing about it, it can be done on your own farm or it can be done by a dealer, and you can convert the corn head back to harvest corn again too. These heads also work not only for sunflowers, but also for sorghum, milo, and even some industrial hemp applications. Anyway, thank you and have a good day.
And welcome to the Alpha Ag Summit presented by Hitchpin. We want to thank you all for attending on whatever platform you are streaming this program on. I'm KLGR Farm Director Scott Colomb up in Redwood Falls, and it's time for our conservation panel. Our panel discussion today brought to you by Copper Cutter. The focus of today's panel will focus on many topics that farmers and ranchers are doing with their conservation efforts and how states are helping farmers and ranchers preserve the land they farm and ranch. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has also placed a high priority on combating climate change and the policies that will affect agriculture. Now, let's introduce our panelists for today's program, including Brian Farr. Brian is the lead on the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition. Ryan Britt, the immediate past president of the Missouri Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. And Dr. Chuck Rice, distinguished professor at Kansas State University. And before we do, if you want to see more about our panelists, you can go to alphaagsummit.com, click on the speakers tab to learn more about our panelists. And before we begin, we remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed on this summit are not those of Alpha Media and do not represent the viewpoints of the Alpha Ag Network, stations, their farm directors, or management. This broadcast is protected by copyright law, and credit should be given whenever sharing or reposting of this video. And if you're watching the live stream, you can also ask questions by going to the chat on the alphaagsummit.com website and ask your question. We'll take those throughout the panel today. And before we get into the questions, I want to touch on a topic that has come up over the last couple of days when it comes to soils and soil conservation. And I'm going to direct this first to Brian Farr. Of course, Brian, the lead for the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition. Brian, the University of Massachusetts put out a report stating that up to 1/3 of the Corn Belt's topsoil has been lost due to erosion. Is that something that you've been seeing here in southwest Minnesota? And if so, are there efforts right now to try and build that back up?
Yeah, sure. There has been some concern. We live out here where the last fall was a ideal fall to get tillage done. So we've seen a lot of tillage in these fields out here. And we had some pretty major windstorms. And you could see the soil that was building up in the road ditches. And as we go around working with producers that did no-till and cover crops and stuff like that, it was a 9-day difference on what you could see where the soil was being held and not blowing around. And it's a concern. And then we get a lot of questions here asking, what is there things out there to help prevent that? Is there programs or what can we do? And a lot of people that have never come in before to ask those questions. So that was really encouraging because no farmer or producer wants to see that stuff happening. So they're proactive in finding a solution to slow it down.
And moving on, Ryan, of course, down in Missouri, some of that soil has moved down the Mississippi River over the last 100 years. Has Missouri also seen any type of topsoil loss? And if so, by how much?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Scott, and thank you. Missouri obviously has seen as much or more erosion loss as anybody else. We, as a state, recognized that we had a disastrous situation coming forward, and in 1982 actually passed a state soils and water tax to provide cost share to help provide practices and reduce soil and water erosion. And since then, in the latest survey that we have, Missouri had, if I believe it is the fewest or the greatest reduction in soil erosion by any state over 10 million cultivated acres. So Missouri definitely sees that need. And as a state, we have made a huge investment from our taxpayers, and they've actually approved that tax twice now, and by the last election in 2016, I think they approved it by over 80%. So we recognize the need, and there's always a lot more work to do, but there are some very good efforts, mostly through our soil and water program and NRCS and the partners that all work with us to address those concerns.
So moving on, Dr. Rice, of course, as we've seen conservation starting to see a renewed interest, is that something that you've seen in Kansas State? And if so, why do you feel that we've seen that increased interest in conservation and maybe changes to how production is done, whether it be either crop or livestock, to try and keep that topsoil where it should be and not downriver or downwind from the original location?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a lot of interest in soil erosion, that loss. Unfortunately, when we're talking about that loss, we're talking about the top 2 inches in most cases, and that's where your best fertility is. And so you're losing nutrients as well as soil. And of course, as mentioned earlier, that potentially goes downstream. In 2012, we had a major drought. And so the Southwest Kansas, the Great Plains, kind of the Dust Bowls in the 30s, there was a lot of soil moving around, even with the best practices. But I think with the improved practices, the interest in ecosystem markets, carbon sequestration markets, there's a lot of synergy benefits of reducing erosion, as well as improving productivity and market potential for soils.
And are we seeing the interest, is it in the row crop, or are we seeing it also from livestock producers that maybe have larger feedlots like they do in Nebraska and Kansas and southern Minnesota, trying to keep the livestock from kicking that dust up also?
Yeah, I can't, there's other reasons for the feedlot industry to be looking at that dust. There's air quality concerns and that, and being good neighbors, there's interest in that. There are row crop producers that are integrating their systems more. I'm starting to see a lot more integration of having livestock on the farm, on a row crop farm, grazing that cover crop to provide some additional income. And even if they don't have livestock, they're working with neighbors to use the benefit of the cover crop. So if you look at an integrated crop livestock system, a lot of interest in that, growing interest in that, and then carrying that over to the feedlot, again, using the products, the manure compost from feedlots can also then be reused back on the soil, and that also helps with improving resistance to erosion.
Well, and you mentioned the cover crop issue, and Brian, I know that has been a focus for you here in Southwest Minnesota, and of course, the last couple of summers we saw heavy rainfall. And of course, cover crops being one of the techniques that producers are now using. Have you seen increased interest in that? And is it the larger producers that are looking at it, or is it kind of anyone that is just trying to keep the soil in place that are looking at the possibility of cover crops and other conservation techniques?
Yeah, in our area, the cover crop has been a buzzword, and there are so many farmers that have not done it in the past. And it's not just the large farmers, or it's all sizes. And what we've been working with is trying to get them started. I know in the past it says, well, you got to do your whole farm this way. We've had a lot of success with getting farmers just started and making it simple for them. 15 years ago, we tried to make it so complicated that we kind of turned off farmers and producers. But once we went to that, just take 20, 40, 60 acres and try it and get started. That made it simpler for them and to try it and make it where they didn't have to do 15 species of cover crops. We got them started with one species. And those people we started working with now, they've got 10 species of cover crops. They know how to do it, know how to manage it. And the biggest thing is how to get it started. Was the big concern is how do I get started? And that's kind of what we were put in place. And I also farm, and with my father to get it started, and we didn't have to buy a lot of equipment to do that. So we were fortunate enough, that I could go out there and try this stuff and work with farmers at a small scale. And now some of these farmers, we got farmers that farm 3,000 acres that are doing this on. So it's impressive. It's a slow process, but it's still a lot of renewed interest out there of getting these cover crops in place and just saving that topsoil. And not just cover crops, doing no-till, reduced tillage. Vertical till is another thing that's coming back to our area that we didn't have for quite a while. So there's a lot of different things that are management-wise that these producers are excited about, and they're excited to learn about too.
And Ryan, down there in Missouri, are you seeing a similar interest in cover crops and or some of the other techniques that Brian was mentioning?
Yeah, absolutely. I could only support what Brian said. We are seeing very similar interest with our both state cost share and our NRCS funds. We've seen huge investments in cover crops. I know that in 2019, over 10% of all the cultivated acres were in covers, and it's just grown since then. It's been a real blessing and one of the tools that we've used. And I think he hit the nail right on the head in that, we're learning if we can keep it simple and kind of teach people how to manage it, because there is a level of management that's required with the cover crop, and it can be very beneficial, but it could also have a lot of consequences if it's not done in a way that benefits the crop instead of it just antagonizes what you're trying to do. And as soon as we start reducing yield with it, then farmers are not going to participate. So I appreciate what he said. We're continuing to see the growth, and we're really just learning a lot of the soil health benefits that, it looks like it's going to take a few years to really be able to measure those benefits and to be able to put data or put numbers to it that we can tell the farmer that, hey, if you do this, then you'll see this kind of return. But it's been very positive, and I very much appreciate that these practices work hand in hand with the conservation practices that we're already doing in our terraces and rotational grazing for the cattle. We're learning how to actually implement some species in some of the grazing to help with erosion concerns. So it's been a very positive experience here in Missouri.
And Dr. Rice, from a university and research perspective, has there been an increased interest in university trials and seeing how conservation techniques, whether it be strip till, no-till, vertical tillage, or cover crops has gone? And what has been some of the results from that? And has that influenced maybe what producers are doing now out in the actual world beyond research?
Yeah, great question. There's a large ramp up in research and extension activities with cover crops, with soil health. And so it's, we're starting to try to get the numbers together, as briefly Ryan mentioned, is get the numbers so we can document those soil health principles. We at Kansas State, we're partnering with Kansas Corn Commission and the Soil Health Partnership, which is in the Midwest. And we have 4 sites in Kansas. And so we've been working with farmers doing strip trials with no-till and no-till plus cover crops. One, as they learn how to manage those cover crops. But we're also then trying to take the soil measurements to document those changes. And it, as mentioned, it takes, we're just now at the third year and we're starting to see the changes in the soil properties, but it really takes more than probably about 5 years before you see those documented changes. But the other thing that's happening too is it takes about 3 to 5 years. What the Soil Health Partnership has shown is a return on investment. So the first 2 or 3 years is a learning curve, and then the producer, the farmer, gets to figure out what's the right adjustments to make the economic benefits show up.
You mentioned the economic and financial considerations. Ryan, is that something that producers have kind of also kept in consideration there in Missouri, whether they're saying, I don't know if it's a good return on investment at this time, or are they saying, this actually works for me, and yes, it actually can save me money in the long run?
Yeah, Scott, I appreciate that question. I think that the early adopters were taking on covers because they thought it was the right thing to do, and they were willing to wait and see that financial benefit in the long run. They felt like it was a good investment, but they were willing to take that risk. Through the cost shares that we have available, we've helped bridge that gap. And so we've had a lot more people take advantage of the program and just accelerated the adaptation. I think now we actually have some guys that are looking at it for herbicide savings or for nutrient reduction at somewhere down the road. And I'll be careful in saying either one of those, because I don't want anyone to just jump in and think that they're never going to put fertilizer on, or they're not going to use any chemicals. But there certainly are opportunities that with the management of the cover crops and as they learn how to make it fit their operation, that they can see some savings, and then in the long run that there absolutely is the possibility of both generating more profit through reduction in cost, but also the cover crop is, as we've learned through some of the extreme weather events that we've had. Brian mentioned the wind, and of course we've had some of these torrential rains that have come very fast, a large amount of water very fast, and these covers have given us the ability to withstand those better. It's not a perfect system. There's no silver bullet, but if we can take small measures and see improvement, then there's a lot of farmers that have seen the encouragement from that. Just, not having the dirt out on the highway that their neighbors have to fuss about after we get a big rain. And those type of situations where farmers are, they're seeing some financial benefit, but they're also trying to do what is the right thing.
Well, and you mentioned the severe weather or the extreme weather that we've been seeing. And of course, being here in Southwest Minnesota, when I moved down here several years ago, we had, for 2 years in a row in June, 30 inches of rain. And of course, as Brian knows, a very, very wet start to the year. Brian, as of course with that water and the movement, did cover crops kind of help at least accelerate the idea in trying to move that and maybe work on that soil water holding capacity here in Southwest Minnesota? And also, I know that you had cover crops at a major ag show several years. Did you see any renewed interest at any of the shows that you were at?
Yeah, for when we started it out, we had about an 8-year cycle of really wet conditions that were going on, spring, even during the summer and things like that. So when we incorporated the cover crops, so we wanted to do some study what that really meant by incorporating the cover crops and infiltration of the water. I did a study on one of my pieces that was tilled every year, 2 to 3 times a year. And then that piece is now, I have done no tillage on it for 8 years. And when we did the infiltration test, I was only able to handle a 1-inch rain before it started to run off. And after the 5-year study, we're at about 4.7 inches of rain before that water starts to move off the field or starts to run off. So once we were able to show that to these producers in those wet conditions, is that it was pretty mind-blowing. We have a rainfall simulator that we show to people, and that's really eye-opening to a lot of farmers how much, if you get that organic matter levels up, is how much that soil is like a sponge. Take it in and get it down through the soil profile. One other thing that, like I mentioned before, I also farm, but I'm usually generally in the field probably a good day to a day and a half before anybody else on those tilled fields, because we do a lot of no-till here also. And I was talking with the co-op, and they do no-tilling. Our co-op offers that service. And I went up there and I said, would you be interested in doing our no-till? And they said, well, not for a couple of days. It just rained an inch. And I said, well, if you get stuck, I will pay to get it pulled out. And they went out there, went around the whole field, and never got a flake of mud on their tires and got it planted. And it was essentially 2 days from a couple of the neighbors and close to me that they were able to even get out and even think about going. So once you can start to show that on a whole field basis of what can be accomplished with it, it's pretty amazing. Then people start asking questions like, wow, how'd you get in there so much earlier? So just the visual part of it, and more people are doing it. That's really exciting to see.
Yeah, it definitely is very great to see that producers are starting to see the benefit. And we actually have a question from a viewer, and they are actually talking about asking for, this is from Alan, no-till challenge. Dirt mounds from varmints such as badgers, skunks, prairie dogs, foxes, etc. create a rough, dried dirt damage to header and combines. Any recommendations for corrective actions or solution? Brian, and then I'll also ask Ryan down in Missouri if you guys have any recommendations of what this producer can do to try and solve this issue.
Yeah, you see that in part of those areas where you don't disrupt the soil and things like that. There are some varmints, fox dens, coyote holes, and things like that. But it's such in a small, isolated area. I mean, the biggest mounds I got to worry about is my nightcrawler mounds, the mittens, because they're all over the place. But for the most part, I've not had any issue with that. And if it is, it's in a very isolated area. It's not a whole farm situation here in southwestern Minnesota anyway. But I could see where if that would be kind of a big deal. We don't have pocket gophers and stuff like that. Like in the old days, we had so many of those around here on our grassland areas. But yeah, for the most part, it's very isolated and we don't have too much trouble with that.
Okay, and we have back to the comments this afternoon. We had another viewer ask, how are cover crops being used in regards to soil compaction, such as radishes? And I know, Brian, you've done extensive information on that. We'll let you take a crack at that question first, and then we'll pass it over to Dr. Rice to see what maybe the university at Kansas State has been researching.
Yeah, the radishes are one of the first things that we started out with, that huge taproot that goes down, and it just gets down into that soil layer. That goes down about 3 feet, 3.5 feet on conditions, depending how long you got that cover crop growing. We started seeing a lot of that after small grains. And some of those radishes I couldn't even get my hands around, and they were 3 feet long. And you really start to think about the soil compaction and what that had occurred. When we do our tillage, we're dealing in that zone of 6 to 8 to 9 inches. And it was just amazing how that tillage radish was able to bust that hard pan up. There was wet areas in my fields that were always there, and it was due to compaction. I started to put radish in that rotation, and I didn't even have to do it every year. I did it every other year. And in a short period of time, those wet areas disappeared. Then the soil was able to take it. And yeah, the radishes are fun because they're fun to watch grow, and people really get talking about it if they've never seen them before when they're growing.
And Dr. Rice, what research, if any, has Kansas State been doing in terms of using radishes or other taproots to work on soil health and any compaction that's been impacted?
Yeah, so we have a couple other colleagues that have been looking at tillage radish, turnips as well. They're great. I really like them because they do get that taproot down there. If you look at the native prairie, it had a diversity of roots, and it had those large tap roots that create them biopores, but like giant earthworms in a sense. And it really alleviated that compaction. I do a lot of work in Brazil. I know that's not the Midwest, but they really rely on those tuberous root crops like tillage radish to help break up compaction. You're using the biology to alleviate that compaction instead of running a plow through the soil. And it really does a lot of benefit. It also cycles nutrients from deep down, 3 feet down, back up to the surface. So it has a lot of other benefits.
And you are watching the Alpha Egg Summit, brought to you by Hitchpin. This is the conservation panel on our second day. Reminder, visit alphaeggsummit.com, click the Enter to Win button, and register for a getaway trip to Florida. That includes a deep-sea fishing excursion, and each time you visit one of our sponsors' videos, you will receive a bonus entries into the drawing. That'll be held at the end of March. And thank you to our Register to Win sponsor, B&S Equipment. So again, thank you to that, to B&S Equipment, for the sponsorship of the Register to Win. Again, you can find that at alphaeggsummit.com. We continue on our panel discussion, brought to you by Hitchpin and by Arrow Copper Cutter. You can find them at coppercutter.com. Continuing on, of course, many producers, we've been talking about the benefits of conservation. Now, maybe some considerations when it comes to the environmental impacts and considerations for what producers should consider and look at if they want to implement conservation on their tillable or even non-tillable ground, whether it maybe you just want to get your yard looking a little bit better. We'll start off with Ryan down in Missouri. Of course, Missouri, very, very hilly in parts of the state down there, with the Mississippi River and several rivers running through the Show Me State. Ryan, what are some considerations for folks in the Central Plains and the Great Plains when it comes to cover crops and or other conservation techniques on their fields?
Well, we have to look at both the short-term and the long-term benefits and consequences. Short-term, almost immediately when you install a conservation practice, be it cover crops or terraces, a pond, so forth, there is an environmental impact and generally a very positive one on the short term, because we're addressing whatever concern we had to start with. But there's also going to be that cost. And so a lot of the practices that we do have a long-term benefit that way out exceeds the cost, but immediately, you have to be able to absorb that cost. And I know I keep going back to cost share, but that's kind of what I know. And so in Missouri and in the NRCS across the country, there are programs available to help bridge that gap, to help meet that immediate concern. Then there's also the management of the practice, whether it be cover crops or terraces, and both of them you have to treat differently. And and no-till is the same way. Excellent conservation practice, the first few years can be difficult, and it requires different equipment, it requires a different mindset, and there's a learning curve to it. But then long term, then once you start building the soil health, you start building that climate or weather extreme resilience. And then you get into the opportunity to start saving on inputs and either maintain or increase yields. Then that's when you really see the payback. So it's a long-term investment, and most of us involved in agriculture are willing to play that long game. We're trying to build or save the resources for our kids, the next generations, or whoever's to come after us, and whether that be the soil or the water quality. And so you have to be focused on that long term to be able to absorb the cost up front.
And to piggyback off of that, we had a viewer comment ask us, when it comes to the issues that producers are raising, when visiting with producers, what issues have they raised when they say they're preventing them from adopting conservation practices? I'll address this question first to you, Ryan, and then to Brian. How have you addressed those concerns for them in Missouri?
It's an excellent question, and it is very common. A producer knows they have a problem, but they don't know exactly how to fix it. And the first step that I recommend for any producer is to walk into their local soil and water conservation district. It's an excellent resource, and most of them are housed in the FSA or NRCS building. And it's a wonderful partnership between NRCS and their conservation districts, where they are able to provide some education And that's what it's going to take, because it's going to take a change in mindset. Just because it's the way our dads and our grandpas did it doesn't mean it's the best way to do it today. And I don't say that lightly, because I've got a lot of respect for how we got to where we're at. But there are technologies available today that they did not have available to them. And so it usually takes education, but also, incentives don't hurt anything, and also help get that accomplished. And then once we're able to start showing them, often if we can get them connected with someone that has some experience, whether that's through like the Soil Health Partnership and a lot of the people that have already, there's no point reinventing the wheel here. Let's go find somebody that's got the similar problem and see what they did. And of course, we're from the show me mistake here. And so if you go show me something that's working, then I got a whole lot more confidence in trying to take it on. And so those are kind of the first steps. There's a lot of great education out there, whether that's through the government programs that are available, or a person can get on YouTube and just look up an issue, and you can get good and bad information, but a lot of good resources out there.
And Brian, are you seeing a similar thing in Minnesota when it comes to producers wanting to do that same thing when it comes to the issues that they raise?
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to just build off of what Ryan was saying too. We got a lot of those concerns up here. We live in Minnesota. It's not possible here. We can't do those types of things. In our area, cereal rye is very, very big in this, so a lot of these guys are planting that after they're harvested in the fall, and then they're planting their soybeans right into it in the spring. I would say that's our most popular thing. And once you were able to show that out there to these producers that it can be done, because up here for the longest time, there's just not enough time. And we don't have a pile of small grains in our area. Small grains are ideal. I mean, if you could get cover crops planted right after small grains, that is the most ideal situation you can have. But now that we're showing there's other different ways like that, like I was mentioning in the cereal rye, it's simple, it's easy, they can get it done. And what Ryan was saying too, I work for the Redwood Soil and Water Conservation District, and we highly encourage producers to come in, because now, or even probably a month ago, is when you start planning those types of things. If you're thinking about doing something like this, because there is a planning that has to go in there. What kind of herbicide are you using? What are you planning to be planting the next year? So there's some chemical carryover things that we got to make sure of. So when you're doing that chemical regimen for your year's crop, that we want to make sure, if you're going to try it in this area, because some chemicals won't allow you to do cover crops where you're going to be successful. So those are the type where you want to start planning now. And I think what Ryan said, get into your NRCS offices, SWCDs. There is financial assistance available in a lot of cases. It's kind of the insurance policy. Everybody's a little bit different, but if they can give you some sort of an initiative or compensation for trying this, so if it does not work out exactly the way it's supposed to in that first year, you're getting a payment with that. Well, we'll find out what didn't work, and we'll continue to find what's going to work in your system and how it's going to affect it. And as what I've been seeing and hearing in our area more than anything, they want to see the economics of it. End of the day, we could say environmentally, all this stuff is great, but they want to see the economics of it. And what's encouraging for me, what we are hearing here now, instead of saying, well, I got 230 bushels acre corn, they're starting to say, now here's how much I made per acre. And that was really encouraging to me. They're looking at the economics, the bottom line, how much they're making. Because we've done some studying here, and some producers that I work with directly, they have changed their input costs, have went down by $90 on a side-by-side comparison with no yield reduction whatsoever. So once we start increasing that organic matter, we can start decreasing the nitrogen that we're going to need out there. So for every 1% we go up, that's 20 pounds of nitrogen we go down, and it's not having any yield impact. And we like doing that instead of saying, well, 20 miles away this happened. We took whole fields and we started doing side-by-side comparisons. Then it seemed like the producers were willing to really look at that data and understand it, because if you say, well, I did it 5 miles away from here, they said that's 5 miles away. They think that's another planet. So if you could do it side by side, show them the economic benefits and show them that cover crops can work here, because like you said too, Ryan, the visual part of it, if you start doing something out there that's kind of odd, people are going to start asking questions. And that's where, the SWCDs and other farmers, we get this mentorship kind of going. That's a big deal.
Very, very true, Brian. And you mentioned doing something different and folks asking questions. And that leads us to our next question for Dr. Rice. Of course, here in Minnesota, we recently implemented the state buffer law requiring buffers around some streams and rivers. And the listener asking, are we seeing an increase in such practices, such as buffers and bioreactors for edge of field practices?
Yeah, Scott, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question. Maybe actually Brian or Ryan might be. I know there's a lot of interest in that and trying to put in the buffers, and it could be multi-use buffers, whether it's a grass or a forest buffer, but it provides a pollinator habitat as well as protecting against soil and water loss from the edge of the field. And so there's a lot of benefits of that as far as increase in acreage. I would have to defer to somebody else.
Yeah. Brian, I know here in Minnesota you work very close with another colleague of yours over at Soil and Water, Christy Zajac. What have you seen when it comes to buffers and edge of field practices, and has that seen renewed interest despite Minnesota's law on that?
Like any law, it was contentious at first, and it's taking cropland out of production. It was 16.5 feet is what they put on public ditches and along creeks and streams. We're seeing some of that. In some cases, it's one size does not fit all. Some of these ditches that we were putting those on, they slope back from the ditch, so there's not a lot of bang for the buck in some areas, but some areas definitely, like especially around the creeks and streams where it was flooding. But we see a lot of things too, like open intakes. Those are the ones that seem to carry a lot of the sediment from the field. So it was contentious here, and there's still some contention. It's contentious at some points yet. But the buffering, in the floodplain areas and those areas where the ditches, where water run over to the ditches into our drainage system, because here in Redwood County, we're the second most extensively drained county in Minnesota. So we had a lot of that buffer that we had to review and take a look at. So it's getting there, and most people just kind of finally adopted it, and we have to go through and monitor it every year.
And Brian, you mentioned the mandates from the state. Ryan, of course, you're the immediate past president of the Missouri Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. Is that something that you had to look at and talk to lawmakers about when it comes to conservation efforts? And also, could we see a possibility of more mandates or increased conservation requirements, either at a state levels or at the national level, now with President Biden looking for issues such as climate change?
It's kind of dangerous for me to jump onto ag policy here. I think there's probably a lot better educated people and minds to be working on policy. But I will say that there is healthy soils legislation actively being passed in several states. And, some are better than others, and different states have different issues. That's been the beauty of the soil and water programs across the country is generally they are locally led, voluntary conservation. And that model has worked for a long time, since Hugh Hammond Bennett first set it up in this, soil conservation service. And that I still think that is the best way for farmers. Nobody really likes anything being shoved down their throat, and farmers are no exception to that. We tend to not respond well to being told what we can and can't do. But I think farmers in general really want to do the right thing. And, we all live off of the land, and we don't want to hurt it. And so I think that the opportunities are there for farmers to do the right thing and to use those cost shares that are available, those edge of field buffering. In Missouri, we just recently, within the last couple of years, have adopted the practice of being able to use bioreactors. And we're in a little different situation in that we don't have a lot of underground tile. Most of our underground tile is related to terraces, and that's kind of a whole different system than field tillage. But we're learning how to make that work in our system. There are certainly benefits to edge of field work, and stream bank stabilization, and we're trying to adopt those practices as quickly as possible. And if we do want to go down the mandate path, I'm very concerned. The possibilities are there to restrict what guys are doing, and that is not the best way to accomplish goals in my mind. I think that the very best thing would be for farmers to recognize that water doesn't leave their farm and just disappear. It's affecting everyone else, and we only see it for a short period. But what we do certainly affects the ones down below us. And so as we improve our systems, as we adopt those practices, whether it's no-till, cover crop, terrace, ponds, stream bank stabilization, all those things that we can do to hold those nutrients and the soil in place for longer, is going to benefit everyone. And if the states recognize that the farmers are doing a good job, I hope that they're really reluctant to try to limit what they're able to do. If anything, I hope that they just encourage it, incentivize it. That system works. There's a perfect example of that. We're seeing it somewhat in the state of Illinois. Champaign County Soil and Water Conservation District started the STAR program, and that program has set an example that other states are looking at. I know Iowa's looking at it, Missouri's looking at it, and Ohio has a similar type of program already going. But that model is to use those soil and water conservation districts to help certify acres that have conservation practices on them, that are producing commodities in a sustainable manner, and then forming a partnership with a processor, whether it be ADM or Cargill. They've got different agreements in place. And that processor is actually paying a premium for buying that farmer's commodity that was raised in a sustainable manner. And I think that's a perfect example, and it's called the STAR program, Saving Tomorrow's Agriculture Resources. That's a perfect example that maybe the Biden administration or those that are making the legislature needs to look at. That is if we're going to adopt some kind of mandate, maybe we need to be looking at those type of systems and how we can continue to build on the good work that's already been done.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Policy is always considered a contentious issue, and heading back to a viewer question that was poised. Alan asked, we used to follow terraces and plant on the contour with smaller equipment with GPS A to B lines. We plant, quote, straight from headland to headland, but this causes soil erosion. And do others see this? Dr. Rice, is that something that producers are starting to reconsider when it comes to planting their fields? Instead of going straight, now they're going maybe back to following their land so that the soil stays put?
Yeah, certainly with the with the GPS equipment and the auto steer, and there's opportunities to do more contouring and preventing some of the headlands planting. The possibilities there, I don't know. Again, from an adoption rate, but it does allow a lot more opportunities to conserve and to plant relative to the landscape position. I think with GPS, the precision planting equipment that's coming online, and a more available drones, soil mapping is also helping with that.
And are we seeing, you mentioned the drones and the auto technology, are we seeing more of that come from university trials, or is the commercial sphere kind of helping drive the adaptation and the implementation of more sustainable practices?
Yeah, actually, innovators are really coming from the startup companies. Blue River Technologies, I think they were bought by John Deere last couple of years. There's other startup companies getting into the space. Microsoft, that's not a startup company, but they're getting more engaged in ag. So I think IBM, Microsoft, Google definitely are coming in. And so they're actually providing a fresh face to ag and a new approach. And so probably the universities need to be partnering up with them to learn how better to use their technologies, and then of course work with extension and producer groups to get those implemented. It's an exciting area right now.
And my final prepared question for today's panel includes, when it comes to resources, Brian, of course, you're with the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition, the second such coalition in the nation, right behind our neighbors in South Dakota. What are some resources the producers can either, if they want to see what Minnesota's doing, or maybe they want to implement or start work on their own soil health coalition in their state? What are some resources?
Yeah, what we were doing in Minnesota, there is so many great different groups that were out there, and a lot of good trainings on the soil health and cover crops and no-till. And it seemed like it was scattered. So we wanted to develop a program at this Minnesota Soil Health Coalition. So there's one-stop shopping. So they could go to this, the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition website. And if there's anything going on in the entire state, we can start connecting those people that are interested in certain things into their certain areas too, because what happens down here in southwestern Minnesota doesn't happen in northwestern Minnesota. So this is something that all these groups and all these great trainings that are going on, we can start putting producers to the groups or the locations where things are happening, and it's not so scattered. There'd be any given day, we'd have 3 or 4 different great trainings going on, but they're on the same day, but they didn't know about each other. So we've kind of taken the hassle out of that, and we're kind of, what the coalition's main goal is, they're kind of the liaison between the producers and what's going on, and even with the SWCDs, is there's funding available. So we've had a lot of traction. It's brand new here. We're in our 2nd year now, and there has been a lot of interest and throughout the whole entire state. So we wanted to make sure we encompass the entire state, not just portions of it, and connect with people. And a lot of those people that we have on the coalition that work with the coalition, they're mentors. So they actually can be available 24/7. So if a producer's got a question at night, sometimes when these businesses are open from 8 to 4:30, but sometimes these questions happen at 7 o'clock at night. So then that way they can get on there, call, get a hold of a mentor, either email or cell phone, and say, hey, how do I do this? How can I go about this? And this really helps them plan for their next day and how to get going on that. And they'll say, well, does this work? Does this not work? What's the nice thing about it, the mentors have tried a lot of things and failed at a lot of things too, but they can take the failures out of it by saying, hey, don't do this. This works great. So that really takes a lot of the stress off the people that they're working, that are interested in getting started. That these mentors, the mentorship program here has been very huge, is that farmers can talk to farmers and see what works and understand their equipment, and that makes that connection a lot easier to do. And if they're scared, they can ask that question any time of the day.
And of course, our panel this afternoon brought to you by Arrow Copper Cutter. And when it comes to some of the adaptive technologies, as mentioned in their intro video, Copper Cutter making the implements for attaching to your regular corn and sorghum heads. Dr. Rice, what are some resources, maybe from a university perspective, or maybe from USDA, that producers should look at?
You're talking about for producers.
Correct.
Yeah. So certainly the extension system is providing those resources across the whole Midwest, around the country. There's being soil health, as Minnesota mentioned, but I think there's the soil health, healthy soils. New Mexico, Washington State have all had legislation to help with education and outreach efforts. We're, like in Kansas, we're developing a soil health network, where we're looking at a network of producers. As Brian said, they can talk to each other, have field days, and have an annual meeting so they can learn from each other. And then we're trying to collect the data so that we can document the changes in soil health or yield or economic benefits. So the extension service is getting more involved and also the research efforts. And it's partnering with the groups, whether it's NRCS or No-Till in the Plains, or in some of the other groups. Nature Conservancy is really getting interested in soil health and managing landscapes to help producers with the soil resources.
And we head back to the questions on our panel. This again coming from Alan. And this is actually directed at Brian. Could the laid off XL pipeline workers build a huge water line to send surplus Missouri River water from Grand Forks to western Kansas to replace the Ogallala aquifer, and wind turbines could pump up the hill? Is that something that you would think is realistic?
Probably not. And I won't get into that too, because that's all political also. I don't get into the politics of it.
Okay, and of course,
yeah, Scott, that gets into water rights across states and boundaries. So it gets very political, very fast in doing that. They've talked about in Kansas pumping now Missouri River in Kansas City across the state to southwest Kansas. So you get transfer of water rights across basins. Be very difficult.
And of course, even
more controversial than oil.
Wow. And we want to thank everyone for joining us on our conservation panel. We've been talking with Brian Farr. Brian is the lead on the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition. Also, Ryan Britt, thank you for joining us. Brian's the immediate past president of the Missouri Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. And thank you to Dr. Chuck Rice of the Kansas State University, distinguished professor of agronomy. The Alpha Ag Network, along with our sponsors, are proud to bring you this Ag Summit. This panel brought to you by Copper Cutter. And a special thanks to our presenting sponsor of the Alpha Ag Summit, Hitchpin. Reminder that the views and opinions expressed on today's panel are not those of Alpha Media and do not represent the viewpoints of the Alpha Ag Network stations, their farm directors, or management. This broadcast is protected by copyright law, and credit should be given whenever sharing or reposting of this video. The Alpha Ag Network is local farm programming, promoting, respecting, and celebrating the industry that drives our communities, agriculture. And that will do it for our conservation panel here on Alpha Ag Summit. Coming up next at 2:30 will be our herbicide panel. Be sure to stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. I'm KLGR Farm Director, Scott Colomb.
Thanks, Scott.